Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology. We connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
Yeah, so another edition, Community and Technology. What's going on in the technology world there, Dave, that our listeners might be interested in?
Well, the least important thing happening in India right now is the government is putting on the kind of censorship that to most of us is unacceptable. They've told Twitter and Facebook, take down all these messages, most of which are things like opposition politicians saying the administration should have done more to stop the COVID epidemic, which is horrible and frightening there. Really, really bad.
Yeah, I think I read they got a million cases every 3 days or something like that, Dave. Is that
1 million cases every 3 days,
wow?
and people are dropping dead right and left because the hospitals have no oxygen. They're not even letting sick people into some of the hospitals because they're so overcrowded.
Wow.
And if technology included how you deal with the vaccine, we might go into some of that. But let's talk about stuff that's a little more familiar to us. What should Twitter do if a government that is mostly democratic and a US ally, tells them to censor things that by our standards are perfectly reasonable? They did attack the government and what the government was doing, perhaps, but they weren't libelous. They generally did not include false information. They certainly were not advocating violence or anything. What's the right thing for Twitter to do when they get that kind of request? An American company operating in India.
That's a tricky question, Dave. My knee-jerk reaction would be they should be neutral and not take sides. But that's that's a bit of a knee-jerk, and I can't help but think about our recent example here in this country, where we had that previous president who just ran amok, in my estimation, with his use of his Twitter account and created all kind of havoc among the people in the U.S. And Twitter came in and essentially shut him down. Now, okay, we're moving to a foreign country. Who is it to make that call that the country's been disrupted somehow by what's happening on Twitter? I think you got to kind of look to the local folks to get some kind of guidance. But that's a very slippery slope, Dave. You have regimes in different countries that may or may not really be working in what you or I would agree is the interest of the people, as opposed to the interest of the self-perpetuation. And where do you draw that line? So now let's just be clear. Let's just reframe this. Folks were using Twitter to criticize the government's reaction and handling of the COVID pandemic in India. That's essentially what's going on?
Yes, in a way that is ordinary political discourse here, most of Europe, or in India 6 months ago. But we have an Indian leader who's scared. Twitter actually took down all the tweets. At least in India, they can figure out where most subscribers are reading from, or most people are reading from. Because among other things, they were threatened by having their India people taken to jail.
That is, Twitter was threatened to having their Indian employees taken to jail?
Yep.
Wow. That was my next question, is what leverage does the government have on Twitter? And I think you just answered it. Or at least that's one piece.
Yeah. Now, I had a fellow at BAI who was our station manager, who in 1976 had a problem because they had gotten calls from Rikers Island where I think some of the inmates had taken over part of the facility, and they called and went on the air live
Wow.
talking about the situation.
Hmm.
New York City government got a judge to insist that, I think it was Frank Millspot, hand over the tapes. And he said no, and he went to jail for a couple of weeks.
The general manager refused.
Yep.
Wow.
So the notion that somebody refusing a government demand is making it has an easy decision. No, here in this country, they put people in jail for it too.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
Free speech has really kind of taken on a whole nother aspect with the advent of the internet and social media. And certainly we've seen quote unquote free speech the last 4 years under this last presidential term, just the havoc that was wreaked by so much disinformation and negative speech that was out there. And so it's a very tricky question. We've talked about this on the show before. I remember you talking about your, I think it was your granddad that you said kept a copy of Mein Kampf, Hitler's famous tomb on his thinking, his worldview, and your granddad's rationale was you got to know what the other guys are thinking. And that's why he thought it was important not only to have it on the shelf, but to read it. So, with that in mind, do we really need to hear all sides of everything? I mean, is that what the soapbox that the internet is? I mean, should that be allowed? I kind of say yes, but again, it becomes really problematic when you have what I would call bad actors out there that are really working to really make trouble. And there's good trouble, as John Lewis would say, and then there's just some really devious, diabolical trouble that really doesn't move the public conversation forward. So, I mean, what's your take, Dave? I mean, given what you've talked about your grandpa and his take, and what's your view on that?
Well, I tend to believe in freedom of speech. Before these questions about hate speech, I was pretty much an absolutist on that. But I also don't think that a California company should be making decisions for India.
Mm-hmm.
And there's loads and loads of examples that I've seen, India in particular, of abuse of power by American companies.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Facebook's country leader was criticized because she was censoring on behalf of the government and knocking out some tweets that were possibly questionable, but the staff at Twitter in India said shouldn't have been.
Mm-hmm.
And that she was courting favor with Modi's government.
Mm-hmm.
Facebook has in India, well, let's go to Australia to have another country involved, basically said, we are Facebook, you're just the government, and we're not going to obey your perfectly reasonable order. In this case, Facebook had been ordered after a parliament passed with much discussion a law that required the web companies to reimburse local news media if they pick up a story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right now, Charter Cable has to reimburse NBC if they pick up a show from NBC.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a crazy policy to say that the news sources should be paid something. It's probably, well, it's a policy I don't like. And a whole lot of American politicians didn't like it because 80% of the primary media in Australia is owned by Rupert Murdoch.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bias there. And Facebook said, well, if you try to enforce your law, well, we obviously have to leave the country.
Mm.
A lot of people, including American politicians, criticized them for that, despite the Murdoch connection. And a few days later, somebody got to Zuckerberg, whoever was making that decision, and said, well, we don't want to lose Australia, and we're going to have this problem all over the place. And if we start leaving it, we'll be out of half the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the similar problem. Oh, actually, Facebook was ordered to pull some things down, but they haven't made the news the way Twitter was. And they backed down. And biggest international internet policy issue in recent history happened in 2012, at a big conference called the WICIT, World Conference on Information Technology. The ITU was scheduled to make an updated treaty. And the question was, could that treaty refer in any way to the internet and what was going over the internet?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the world thought that there should be some international control of what happens over the internet. And the United States backed unanimously, after some arm twisting by the European Union, took the opinion that the United Nations has no place in the internet and they must be kept far away and allow the companies to do and the countries to do whatever they felt like.
Wow.
Very, very strong. Putting out people with ties to the US government, a former ambassador, put out really abusive stories about the Secretary General of the UN.
Mm.
And it was clearly, now, people I respect, like Vint Cerf, strongly supported keeping the UN away from the internet, knowing that some UN countries, including China, and Saudi Arabia, strongly censored. And he thought it was a freedom of speech issue. The US government didn't care about freedom of speech. There were 13 people on the US delegation. I was out there, I wasn't on the delegation. There were 104 people in the delegation. 13 people from what are called in Washington three-letter agencies. DOD, NSA, HSA. They were not there to protect freedom of speech. They were there to make sure that the UN didn't get anywhere near anything like security that make it harder for the NSA to do what the NSA does so well around the world.
Okay, a whole nother agenda. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And everybody, no, I was about to say everybody knew it, but many people believed it was a freedom of speech argument. And it was a perfectly reasonable thing. Well, something was pretty influential in that. Google, which avoids putting anything political there, and usually avoids taking political stands, turned over its home page to a plea for the world not to destroy freedom on the internet. And that, of course, Google's homepage has a very large audience.
Mm-hmm.
This was surprising. Now, according to a source that is deeply involved and not objective, Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, 6 months later said, well, what could we do? The government insisted. Now that may be somebody's biased observation, but Google was showing its political power, and Facebook has done that in India. Right now, the government of India, government of any country, Turkey, for example, would be in deep trouble if it banned Facebook from the country. Because there are more Facebook users in India than in the United States.
Wow.
Everybody's on Facebook.
Hmm.
And so Facebook threatening to leave is enormously powerful. And I'm also seeing Facebook and Google around the world buying politicians right and left and buying the people who might influence them, the lobbyists,
Hmm.
in enormous numbers. People in the EU are really upset about it because there had always been lobbying in Brussels. But this was a whole nother order of magnitude. So maybe we should take that back home.
Yeah.
Issue
Go ahead.
around the world.
I
Go ahead. You've got
you
more.
just, talking about I had never even thought about the issue of the UN possibly having any kind of role over regulation of the internet. And to me, it just raises as an intriguing notion. When the UN has largely been ineffective in so many things. Great idea in terms of what its mission is, but neutered in many ways by the U.S. and a couple of the other big powers. But I mean, should there be international rules of engagement, like there are in warfare, for instance? When you look at information being, this information warfare, some would argue that the whole information landscape is one of very similar to warfare, in that you have folks pitting against each other, interests fighting against one another. And could there be theoretically, some way to regulate that internationally that would lay down some kind of ground rules? That, it's just an intriguing notion, Dave. I don't know that it could work, but it's certainly intriguing idea in terms of just regulating, how globally we exercise our speech and interactions on this global platform.
Well, in order to make the point, at the Wicket, which was a 2-week-long meeting, I would say the whole time, I think it was in the first week, Tunisia, which had a democratic government, this was a little bit after the Arab Spring, introduced a resolution opposing the use of the internet for child pornography.
Okay.
The US opposed that resolution.
Get out of here.
Because that would put the internet in the hands of the United Nations.
Okay.
And
Precedent.
that was introduced knowing the US would oppose it to show what it means. The big issue had come 4 years before. One of the first things Amadou Touré, who became a friend, did when he became Secretary General was propose an international treaty on security over the internet that would put the UN on record that countries should not be eavesdropping in other countries and other basic securities issues, that the Russians should not destroy the power grid in the Ukraine, as they briefly did during the war with Ukraine, and that the Chinese, what did the Chinese just do? They were blocking some public functions in South Asia when a country had criticized them. That UN treaties about international security have a strong precedent and make sense. The world would probably have supported him on that. At the Wicket itself, they came up with a treaty that had a very mild clause. It, in effect, prevented said the United States should not prevent somebody in Iran, where we have a total blockade, from subscribing to the New York Times. It was deliberately chosen to be completely innocuous and totally inoffensive. And the US, Terry Kramer, US ambassador, made an eloquent speech about why this was unacceptable, because it was the UN getting involved in the internet, which should not happen. And the US walked out of the meeting and refused to sign the treaty that the next day was approved by 2/3 of the countries of the world.
Mm.
Because most of it was very ordinary stuff. It was a renewal of the basic telecommunications treaty and made some very ordinary corrections to it. Not controversial stuff. The US really was offensive at this meeting. There was a move by the Africans to bring down cartel pricing for them to connect via internet traffic. And the US shot it right down. And there was a move, I don't know if it was from the Africans, could have been from the Indians, to insist that patent charges be reasonable because they were driving up the cost of cheap cell phones. And the US shut it right down. An organization we're both involved with, the Internet Society, was some of the strongest support for the US on this. And Kathy, the head of the Internet Society, and Sally, the chief policy person, played as strong a role in these fights as he could. So the US and this international stuff, well, why we talk about free speech and we talk about democracy, when it comes down to it, we ship arms to Saudi Arabia for brutal, almost genocidal type war against Yemen. And we have a president who had a favorite dictator in Egypt. But I'm pontificating too much. I talk too much about things like this.
Well, but it's really an intriguing area, Dave. I mean, the internet is a global communications network, and it's a big free for all. It's unregulated, which for the most part is a very good thing. But then you look at how it's abused, and you look at how government can use it to oppress people and to keep information away from people. And in some ways, I kind of wish there were some basic ground rules that, perhaps the UN could promulgate. But, I don't know how that could happen without all the special interests and moneyed interests and political interests essentially sabotaging it. So I think what we're left with is a free for all, and that's kind of where we are right now today. That's how I see it.
And there are no simple answers in this.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who take the simple answer. The internet should be independent and not regulated. Most of those people don't think any business should be regulated. There's a fair amount of that kind of thinking, called libertarian sometimes by some people. And that doesn't happen to be my point of view. But there is some people who make a very simple idea about government. Government should be avoided, except for defense and protecting contracts between people. We have some people who go very close to that idea on the Supreme Court right now. And there's a lot of people in Washington like that.
Yeah, to me, that's unfortunate, David. In my mind, government, is a contract between the people and the state that says government exists to protect and perpetuate the interests of its citizens. And I think that includes putting a check on unbridled capitalism and business, whose only interest is making money and not in the general good. I mean, they'll put out products that are poisonous to the environment, that are poisonous to people. I mean, the history of the last of the 20th century is littered with all kinds of industry abuses that were checked and reined in by government to the benefit of the general population. You look at the lead poisoning, you look at the pollution of the air and the water. I mean, so many things that would not be reined in if it were not for government. Businesses, looking at the next quarterly returns, and dollar returns are not equal to, in my mind, to human returns. And I think that's the business of government. But as you say, there are a lot of folks that disagree with that. Yeah.
Well, there's another issue that's going to start coming soon, and I'll bring it up as we come back from the break we're about to take.
Okay.
What if an extreme right-winger took over the company that makes all the equipment for the phone company, and AT&T was considering buying equipment from Charles Koch, the mega billionaire who's funded the Tea Party, all of the Trump stuff, clearly a right-winger. The company that supplies the equipment to the phone company, like Huawei, often manages to know what's going on in that equipment. They're sending technicians in to check and repair things all the time. This has become a big issue in the Netherlands. Do I want Charles Koch with access to my phone records and even my phone calls? Well, Koch Industries just put $500 million to take effective control of a company called Mavenir, a leader in Open RAN radios that they are trying to sell around the world, including to AT&T and Verizon. In fact, Mavenir is saying that because we want more buyers in the United States to buy U.S. goods, and they're one of the few U.S. makers of radio, the government should step in and require that AT&T and Verizon buy from Mavenir, or one of their two very, very small competitors who make Open RAN. So it's an issue that just came up and could well be on the table. But it's time for a break.
Okay. We'll be right back. This is WHCR 90.3, the voice of Harlem. Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed. Okay, we're back. That was a little musical break with Pharoah Saunders is Thimby. This is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3, The Voice of Harlem. And I'm Stu Reed. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave, welcome back. Okay,
Yeah.
but before the break, Dave, you were telling us about one of the Koch brothers or Koch brothers, I'm not sure how you say his name, buying into a big telecom firm and some potential dangers and risks that that poses. Run that by us again, if you would.
Okay. A modestly sized company called Mavenir makes telephone equipment, and they're one of the leaders in the new field of what are called Open RAN radios. Open RAN is an attractive concept. It says the radios that run your phone system, mobile phone system, should be able to work on any equipment anywhere. And the phone companies can save money by not buying from the handful of companies that make the current radios, Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei, ZTE, and Samsung. And it's become something of a movement. It's wildly exaggerated its importance, but it's a good idea. And there currently is a big thing in Washington about how we have to support American technology, and in particular, get Chinese companies away from telecommunications.
Mm-hmm.
And there's $1 billion about to come for research in telecommunications from Washington. Probably a good idea. I actually, a while back, mentioned Mavenir as a company whose research should be supported because it's a good technology and they're a small company that could effectively use government money to move things forward in research and engineering. Last week, they sold effective control of the company to Koch Industries Investment Fund. $500 million. They needed it desperately. They've been losing money for years. They thought they were going to have an IPO. It failed, and they're struggling. Now, do we want somebody with a very extreme political view having access to everything in the phone network, probably including a lawful interception, otherwise known as wiretapping? That's a scary thought. It was a dangerous thing for the company to do this because a whole lot of people would not want their prospective customers like AT&T to be vulnerable either to the Chinese or to the US Tea Party and the people behind the riot on January 6th in the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
I'd think twice about buying my phone service from a company that had a lot of that equipment involved, especially something as fundamental as the radio for a wireless outfit. What do you think?
You know, I'd agree with you. I mean, it's a very scary thought. You know, I guess we feel as though there's some protection when we have so-called public companies, you know, like the AT&Ts, like the Verizons, where you don't have any particular person or interests that are running it. You know, you have boards of directors and shareholders that are looking at the bottom line and their financial interests, but at least presumption is that there is no political motivation in how they run the companies. Then when you get somebody like the Koch family involved in a major way in the technology, that's a very frightening proposition to me. I'd agree with you. I'd be very concerned. You know, given the nature of technology, I mean, there's so many ways to subvert and to utilize it in ways that, you know, we don't know what's going on in terms of the tracking and the monitoring and the surveillance. It's very concerning. Now, let me just understand, Dave. This radio, is this like an open source type of radio? What's unique about this particular radio that these guys just bought into?
It's not open source. The companies keep their own code, but the hardware is open.
Okay.
Designed that you could buy this radio and go to Dell or IBM or Quanta or anybody and run the software on that server.
Mm-hmm.
It's also part of a movement with open interfaces so that the radio can connect to a distributed unit in the tower that controls what the antenna does and so on. So the idea came out of Stanford about 8 years ago that it would be more efficient if the phone companies could buy their networks in parts from many vendors and connect the parts. And that's become a movement. And some people have convinced people in Washington that since that's going to be a big change, maybe the traditional vendors who are in Korea, China, Finland, and Sweden, and they're fewer and fewer. The US once upon a time had Lucent. That was bought out by Alcatel in France.
Mm-hmm.
Alcatel was bought out by Nokia in Finland. There's not much left. Would be knocked out and replaced by new companies, maybe including Parallel and Altiostar and Mavenir, who developed as the leaders in making this kind of radio in the United States, or designing some of it. And Mavenir was just speaking before Congress about 2 weeks ago about how important it was to support them. And I have a statement from their lead, John Baker, about how the US, in order to support them, should require the phone companies to buy from America. And they're the lead in America. The two other companies that are fairly good at making this, one is Altiostar, which is actually selling them to Rakuten in Japan. So we're starting to see they work. And the other is Parallel Wireless, which has an investment literally from the CIA.
The CAA?
CIA,
Oh, CIA. Oh, my
small
goodness.
investment fund
Wow.
designed to support companies whose work is important to them.
Wow.
And some of that money went into one of the three open rent. Well, there's a fourth JMA, but they haven't sold any to anybody.
Let me just recap for our audience who may get lost in some of the details of what we're talking about. Basically, we're talking about radio technology that's used in the cell phone networks. And we're talking about who controls that. This kind of way in the background, but it's important things to know. The U.S. has been fighting very hard to keep the Chinese out of control of a lot of that equipment. Huawei is the big company that has been identified as a potential enemy of the state, if you will. But now we're looking at right-wing financial interests, the Koch brothers, potentially buying into some of these equipment manufacturers that are the backbone pieces, some of the backbone pieces of our cell phone network. And, you know, the question that Dave and I are now talking about and bringing forward to you guys, our audience, is this something that we need to know about? Is this something we can support? Certainly there needs to be some sunlight brought out as to who is owning and running the technology that so much of our daily activity runs on.
And I think I'll leave it at that, because I think we've got the facts in front of people.
Okay.
And there's not much more to say other than that you and I are not happy with that.
Yeah.
But let me take you back to something you asked before the break. We were talking about India censoring Twitter and Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And I said that things were horrifying over there. During the break, I glanced at the Times. First big headline, India passes 200,000 deaths.
Wow.
They're soon going to be past the United States, which is by far the world leader in number of people who've died from COVID. Second headline there was, let me call that up and get it right. Their father was dying, so two brothers in India hunted for oxygen. Now on that, Twitter's played a very important role. My Twitter feed, I have a number of technologists in India that I follow on Twitter, has been inundated with requests, especially Dinesh Khan, who writes for the Economic Times, for oxygen, hospital beds, medicine, for people they knew who were dying. I've been swamped by that. And normally somebody who swamps me in Twitter, I would shut down. But on this, it let me understand and see in my gut what was going on there. Now, we're criticizing Modi in India for telling Twitter to censor his opponents. Well, it can happen here. They didn't bring Twitter into this, but again, the New York Times headline, Cuomo aides spent months hiding nursing home death total. Now, the people who are hiding that one, you and I don't need to tell the audience how dangerous something like that is, knew they probably wouldn't get anywhere trying to force it down, trying to enforce rules at Twitter. But I suspected if they could, they would be happy to. So it can happen here, as we've been discovering the last 4 years.
Yep.
Well, let me take you back again to technology. Phones. We're constantly reporting technology, the latest, greatest, hottest, fastest phone, and the new chips from companies like Qualcomm that will make your cell phone faster. Do you care?
You know, Dave, I'm glad you brought that up because I absolutely do not care. I'm amazed at the marketing hype out there around the fastest phone, the best phone, and in particular, we've talked about this a lot before, 5G. We got a 5G national network. We got the best 5G. We got the fastest 5G. And they're throwing around all these techno terms, but no one's talking about how, in fact, it will improve your service. And for me, I don't know. I do listen to music on my phone. I do occasionally watch a video stream on my phone, though not very often. More often on my tablet or my computer. I'm sure there are folks out there that are more phone-centric, perhaps, than I am. So maybe I'm kind of missing something. I'd like to know what that is, but from where I sit, a faster phone does zero for me. And I don't really see any advantage to these so-called 5G phones. I'm perpetually amazed at the folks that spend $500 and more on a mobile phone. For me, the basic $200 phone, Android, does everything I need it to do. What are your thoughts, Dave? I mean, do you have a fancy phone? I know you're a techno geek, so do you have one of the latest, greatest Apple iPhones?
About as cheap a phone as you could get. I don't have much money. I would upgrade to a phone with a larger, better screen and a better camera, because the camera is useful all the time. There is nothing that people do on phones, or many people do on phones, that is any different on a fast phone than on a medium range phone, with the notable exception of playing games. Games can use all the speed you throw at them because they're trying to do fancy graphics.
Right.
And that's a reason to go for the best, fastest phones. There's a lot of people who want Apple phones at whatever cost. And they're buying $1,000 Apple phones that do very little more than a $300 Android phone would do. But that's what people want, and that's one of the reasons Apple is by far the most profitable company on earth.
Mhm.
Sometimes along, depending on the oil price, with Saudi Aramco. Google's profits just went up 34% or something. Despite a pandemic, it's still on.
Well,
The
maybe
economy.
because of the pandemic, Dave. Maybe because of the pandemic, in terms of there's so much FaceTime now that folks are using the computer. I know so many folks that are not techno folks, maybe like you and I, that have become really good at Zoom and spending a lot of time in front of their computer, whereas a year ago they were not. So I
And
think tech firms have benefited from that.
Zoom is perfectly happy on a second-rate 4G network on a $200 phone
Mhm.
and looks exactly the same as it does on a 5G network that's running at 300 megabits. Because Zoom runs at about 1 megabit.
Yeah.
That's what it needs.
Mhm.
Your video, most of it's running at less than a megabit. And even a 4K video is about 10 megabits.
Mhm.
So that the 4G LTE phones, not to be confused with 4K video, can use 10 or 15 megabits for a perfect picture, and less than that for the way they usually go, and work fine on the 4G LTE network. And you put them on the 300 megabit 5G network, and you don't see any difference whatsoever. In other words, the 5G networks still do nothing. But because that's a geek joke. There was once a phone system called ISDN, and it still does nothing, was the conclusion.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not a surprise that Stu and I laughed at that one.
Mm-hmm.
There are two things a 5G phone can do for you. It can look really impressive on the speed test when you want to impress your neighbor. And it can light up the 5G light on your phone. But there's almost nothing practical.
Mm-hmm.
However, the price of 5G phones is now so close to the price of 4G phones that you might as well go for a 5G phone, which may have a few advantages over the next few years. Right now, T-Mobile is selling a 6.5-inch 3-camera 5G phone for $264 from Motorola.
Wow.
So at a comparable 4G phone, it's just not that much cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
So it's selling like hotcakes. I have probably the highest estimate in the world at 650 million 5G phones selling this year. And that's also because all the Apple new phones, all the Apple 12s are 5G. You can't buy a 4G Apple phone in the latest line. Mm-hmm. And half the phones in the United States. Also England and Australia and Canada. But 5G is taking up. 5G is exploded in China first, where 70% of the phones in China last December were 5G. And the prices are down to $150 to $210 on several excellent phones from major manufacturers. But that's now coming west in the US because of Apple, and everywhere because of how cheap the phones are getting. Mm-hmm. For what it's worth to me, and I make my living on the industry, it's really significant that there's so much 5G. But for people out there using them, latest greatest phones do almost nothing. And 5G is not much faster for the one thing speed does matter, which is game playing. 5G doesn't actually add very much to that. It was supposed to have much lower latency, but that's not the way they're building the networks. Speaking of which, it's appropriate for me to let people know when I have a conflict of interest. And I have a new client for whom I'm writing some stuff about their products, who makes software that runs on the web and does things like keep track of Verizon's 25,000 miles of fiber. So I'm learning a lot about actual fiber networks. Nothing that was surprising, but I'm getting a lot of detail. So if we're talking about building fiber networks, listeners should know I have a client in that business and I have a conflict of interest. It's not likely to come up very much on this show.
Okay. We're not gonna worry about that, Dave, but for our listeners out there, you did hear it here. 5G, don't believe the hype unless you got some real special needs. And from what I'm hearing from Dave, that's like gaming and that's about it. Otherwise, it's not worth spending that extra money. Wait for the price to come down.
Well, I disagree.
Okay.
Because the price has already come down to what's often $30 more expensive than a 4G phone. And for
So,
$30 on a $300 phone, I might buy it for what it could do in the future.
oh, you
So
future-proofing.
and people, I think that it's sensible to buy a 5G phone if you're going to spend $300 or more for a phone, even though it still does nothing that's important for you. Because it might
Okay.
over the next year or two.
Okay.
And I know that so many people are making that decision that over 600 million 5G phones are going to sell this year, out of the 1.4 million phones that are likely to sell in total.
Okay. Well, let's leave it right there, Dave. We're about out of time. So this has been Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed on WHCR 90.3 FM. And we've been kicking it around technology and how it relates to you and your everyday life. So stay tuned next week for more conversation, Community and Technology, 90.3 FM. Dave has one final comment before we leave. Dave.
Where I'll have a report from Ethiopia, where two of the biggest networks on Earth are about to be built with 110 million Ethiopians.
Okay. Look forward to that. Okay. Thanks for tuning in. This is 90.3 FM, WHCR, the voice of Harlem. Thanks for checking us out. See you next week. Good night, Dave.